Welcome to part two. Um, so I think the first part might have ended abruptly. Excuse me, my dog uh, needed me. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. And so we're moving away from the types of abuse and we're moving into the red flags, right? And so some of the red flags that you'll notice in domestic violence, dating violence, relationships are really one is a history of cruelty towards animals. It's very common, and so that's kind of self-explanatory, right? The cruelty towards animals, but there's also really rigid traditional gender roles in domestic violence, dating violence, relationships. Again, it's rooted in power and control and the imbalance of power and control. In particular, heterosexual relationships, they fall into that traditional notion of, this is my castle. I'm the king of my castle, and you're lucky you're even in it, type of thing, right? These are the roles and responsibilities of each person, and one carries really the weight of those responsibilities. There's also jealousy is a huge one. So jealousy is really kind of gigantic in terms of um, really thinking that your partner is cheating on you, and you're very suspicious, and not just slightly. I mean, this is like excessively jealous, right? Since domestic violence is rooted in power and control and the imbalance of power and control, it's going to make sense that there's going to be controlling behaviors. On the surface, it might look like it's chivalry. On the surface, it might look like it is that they just care. But if you start looking at a pattern and you start looking and you notice a pattern, you're like, wait a minute, the person always has to have the say-so. The person always has to be at the center. That's a red flag. Also, domestic violence and dating violence relationships are highly correlated with stalking. And so I'm hoping that you all know what stalking is. Well, I'm hoping that you all know what stalking is. Stalking is where one person is followed either physically or virtually, where they have tabs on someone. And so with modern technology, unfortunately, it's made it easier to stalk someone. And I'm continue to learn new ways that students are telling me, did you know that the iPhone does this? Do you know that Snapchat does this? And I'm like, oh, goodness. Oh, because my lens is the violence against women and children. And while the technology, well, that's not the perspective of the technology when it's being innovated. That's how I see it, as like, how is that going to be used to control someone? Because it is, right? It is. And so, for example, the GPS is used against someone. You have, like, on iPhone, someone let me know about on locations, your phone tracks where you go. If you have that on, it tracks where you go and how long you stay at each place, and it maps it out. You also have, I think it's like Find Your Friends. And so if you have it on and your friends have it on, then you know where your friends are and where you're at throughout the day. Now, some people will say, well, Melanie, what's the big deal? Just turn that app off. Well, in a domestic violence relationship, many times there is not that option, right? Because it's rooted in power and control and the imbalance of power and control. So that relationship will say, no, you need to put Find Your Friends on, right? It is, I need your password to Facebook and Instagram. We need to have one mutually together so that my eyes are on it. Yesterday, one of the students said, well, Snapchat has something where you can see where they're located, right? Your friends are located. So these are all mechanisms that actually help folks virtually stalk another person. But then there's also the old school stalking, right? So where someone is literally being followed in another car, they're followed, they're being observed at work. And I've known cases myself, like where I've worked with staff members that have been in violent relationships and their partner visits frequently, is out in the car, or is coming to the place of employment and sitting around like the whole entire shift, right? So again, that's stalking, and it's highly correlated with domestic violence and dating violence relationships. There's also impression management. So impression management, I briefly talked about this before, and this class has taken a drama, has went over dramaturgy. You guys are all experts on dramaturgy, so you know what I'm talking about when it comes to impression management. Yes? Yes. And so impression management is exactly that, how one tries to create or manages and how other people are seeing them, right? So managing one's impressions. And for perpetrators of abuse, they're putting on a mask and a front stage for folks to make them sound like, oh, what a great father, what a great mother, what a great citizen. Oh my gosh, they're a wonderful employee. A word that's oftentimes used is, oh, she was so charming. In particular, he was so charming, is very common. And so that is being manipulated, and that's a mask and a front stage that's being utilized. When the doors close, there becomes a different reality. And the mask comes off, there's a backstage, and that's when the violence takes place. It works to the benefit of the perpetrator, because if and when the survivor of the abuse comes out and says, hey, so-and-so, y'all, so-and-so is hurting me, so-and-so is abusing me, that overwhelmingly the victim's not believed, because everyone's like, everything I know about him or everything I know about your partner is loving, kind, and generous, and what a great employee, and what a great da-da-da-da, right? And so it works for the benefit of the person that's causing the abuse. It's, again, created by design. Also, you'll see on your notes, it says blames, minimizes, and denies, right? And so that you see the perpetrator will always blame external factors. Well, you know how I get when I drink. You know how when I do drugs. You know how I get when you piss me off and you don't know when to shut up, right? Victim. So typically when you hear folks speak, you can quickly kind of tell which one is the abuser, because they typically take no responsibility whatsoever, and they blame external factors like for everything, and never do they take accountability of, maybe I need help. Maybe drinking does this to me, but I keep drinking, right? Maybe drugs does this to me, but I keep doing drugs, right? And so I'm responsible for my behavior. No. It's drugs are the problem. Alcohol is the problem. My boss is the problem. It is you're the problem, right? If you just knew when to shut up, if you just knew when to keep your mouth, closed, then I wouldn't have had to do this, right? So again, blaming external factors. We're going to return to that in a little bit, right? So we're going to get back to that, unfortunately. But I want to move forward in terms of the cycle of violence. So that's the next slide. And the cycle of violence, you'll notice on this slide, I have those three names, right? So I have honeymoon, tangibility, and explosion. What I don't have on them is what's happening in each particular phase. This is where you're going to want to take your notebook out, and this is where you're going to want to take down notes in regards to each stage, because you'll be responsible for letting me know what's happening in each stage, okay? So 1 second, let me reach over to get my charger, because my phone is going to go kaput. Hopefully it will be able to reach. Probably not. I'm gonna have to do some movement here. But so again, giving you time to get onto the cycle of violence. Get your notebook out, because you'll be needing to be taking some notes. I want to let you know that I miss you all. I miss you. I hope you all miss me. It fits. I don't have to change it. Good. Great. Okay. So the cycle of violence, I like to start off with the first phase, which is the honeymoon stage. And honeymoon stage is exactly that. You first meet someone, you feel all warm and fuzzy, they feel all warm and fuzzy. Maybe he's the one. Maybe she's the one, right? Rosy colored glasses, the excitement, spending time together, the attention, the I love yous, the best foot forward, the impression management on both ends, right? Okay, but it only lasts so long in a domestic violence relationship, well, in any relationship, honeymoon stage, right? And so let's say in this case, the honeymoon stage was 6 months. 6 months. The mask eventually starts cracking because you can't have a front that long, right? And the reality or backstage is not peek through the mask. So we move to tension building. It's in a circular format, right? So then you have the tension building that is the person becomes irritable and agitated. And you're like, I've never seen this side of him. I've never seen the side of her. But you can feel the tension. You can feel maybe even the anxiety in the room. And they might be cursing. They might be really aggressive with their actions, with their words and their actions. They might be coming home and they throw their bag. They might get upset and hit the door. They might hit a wall. Something's in the way and they break it, right? So that you're seeing an escalation of behaviors, right? So you have the honeymoon, then it starts going to the agitation, right? So tension building is the agitation, and the agitation is increasing, and it's beating kind of like a pulse. It's getting faster and faster, and it's escalating. So you had honeymoon for 6 months. You had tension building for, let's say, 2 weeks, and then the tension building goes into full-on explosion. This is the stage of the climax of the abuse. This is the punching, the kicking, the hitting, the slapping, the raping, the name calling, all those different types of abuse that we visited, right? Whatever different types of abuse that are happening at any particular time, because remember the definition that several different types are happening at any particular time. Usually there's never one type of abuse happening at one time. There's always multiples from that list. And so you have this climax of the abuse, of whatever types of abuse taking place, explosion. We're going to get back to this, right? There's an explosion. Let's say it's the first explosion. 6 months, 2 weeks, 1 day where there's an explosion. And it's circular format, right? The cycle of violence. So that means we go back up to honeymoon. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. It'll never happen again. I promise I'll change. I don't know what I would do without you. Please don't leave me. I love you. Gifts are being bought. Attention overload. This is just the shoulda, woulda, couldas. The shoulda, woulda, couldas. And you're like, wow, well, I've never seen that side of him or her, and they're sorry. And I consider myself a very understanding person. And so I'm like, okay, well, that can't happen again. Okay, you got it? You got it. Okay, good. So now you're in the honeymoon stage again, right? Shoulda, woulda, couldas, and you're reconciling. And so initially it was 6 months, but now the honeymoon lasted like 3 months, right? So then you have the 3 months, and the 3 months last, okay, so you have that. And then it goes into tension building, right? The next stage. And this is where you're, okay, here she's upset again. Okay, I think we've been here before. Like, oh goodness. And then what happens is the tension building goes into the explosion, the climax of the abuse. So you had 6 months that turned into 3 months, right? You had tension building that lasted 2 weeks. Now it's a week. And then you have the explosion 1 day. And then you have the honeymoon again. And so what you're going to see is this cycle is going to go more frequently, and it will become more violent as time goes on. I'm going to repeat the cycle one more time. So then the honeymoon, right? The shoulda, woulda, coulda. I'm sorry, please forgive me. Okay, and then you have the tension building. And so what happened is in the tension building is really the survivor of abuse, the person that's enduring the abuse, experiencing the abuse, begins to learn to walk on eggshells, attempting to try to do anything and everything possible to attempt to prevent a violent act from happening, to attempt to prevent the explosion from taking place. But one thing to know about domestic violence relationships and dating violence relationships is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? So there is no like, if you do this, this is the recipe. And so, but that's a stage of called walking on eggshells, attempting to try to prevent the abuse from taking place and trying to please that person so that they're trying to be perfect. And what eventually happens, it leads to the explosion, going back to the explosion. And the survivors respond in 3 different ways. Some will fight back, and it, like self-defense, right? They're not, excuse me, they're not initiating the violence, but they are defending themselves. And they might be defending themselves physically, right? And then number 2 is some people will attempt to escape, right? So there's an incident, there's an explosion, and they'll try to flee. But many folks will say, I've attempted to flee, but then I have to be reconnected. We live in the same place. We share children, that now they're even more angry. So the level of violence has just increased, right? So it's like it didn't really solve anything. If anything, it might have angered the person even more. Some people have also said with number 1 is that people will say, well, I didn't physically fight back because have you seen my partner? Like my partner could kill me, right? There's no way my partner is way stronger than me. Or if I fight back, I know that he or she is going to be even that much more angry at me, and that puts me at greater risk, or my children at greater risk. And then the third one is, and I always put a little asterisk by it to be very mindful of this and very careful, is that some survivors will endure the abuse. And this stage, I have to really stress, is fight or flight. This is not sitting in a sociology class and say, if I was in a relationship and this took place, let me tell you what I would do. No, this is not sitting in a social class, right? And saying what you would do. This is fight or flight in the moment of what do I need to do to survive for myself and for my children. And many survivors will say that they'll endure the abuse. They might go down in fetal position, cover the important parts of their body, in attempts to protect, vital organs, and wait for the abuse to end. A very fascinating thing that many survivors will talk about is that many of them have what's called like an out-of-body experience. And let's say there's a physical component to it, there's physical violence, and they're being physically battered. That many of them talked about them leaving their body and watching it as an outsider looking in as if it's a movie. And that this movie is, it's like the notion of really being on a plantation, right? And slavery on a plantation. It's like, okay, well, massa is making me do things with my body. Massa is making me work on this plantation. So massa has my body, but massa doesn't have my mind, right? So I'm already thinking about revolution. I'm already thinking about work sabotage. And that's a way of self-determination and survival and empowerment in the most severe cases. Survivors mimic that and will say, he didn't even, he went to town on me. He went to town on me and he didn't even know that I wasn't there. I wasn't even there, right? That I'm not going to give him that because he was there beating me up and I wasn't there. That fool didn't know, right? It's, again, a way of self-determination, self-preservation, and really self-empowerment. Very fascinating. Many of those stories were very moving for me. And then, so again, you have those multiple ones, and people will use a variety of them. Many survivors that fight back or defend themselves also get arrested for domestic violence. And if you think about the traumatic nature of that, if that you're a victim of abuse and you're trying to protect yourself and your children, and you do physical means to protect yourself, that you can get arrested, right? That there's policy and procedure are different, right? And so what's supposed to happen is that law enforcement would come in and they would assess the wounds, right? Are they self-defense wounds? Are they aggressive wounds? And that's what's supposed to happen, but that doesn't mean that's what always happens. That's policy, but procedure can be very different, right? Domestic violence is one of the highest numbered calls that come in, but yet there's a limited amount of training with law enforcement and cadets. It doesn't match. And that's not an individual officer issue. That's really a policy issue that needs to be looked at and really changed. And so that officers or cadets at the very beginning can understand the dynamics of domestic violence and truly understand it forward, backwards, and sideways, so that when they come onto the scene, they'll take it that serious, because their life's at stake too when it comes to domestic violence calls. But the messaging to victims when the victim is also arrested, victimized at home, and then re-victimized by the system, right? And then you have that going to court. So that potentially someone could be re-victimized 3 different times. Their perpetrator, law enforcement, and then the judge. And how devastating that can be, right? And so then you have that explosion, and then you go back to honeymoon. The shoulda, woulda, couldas. I'm sorry, please forgive me. The honeymoon acts as an anchor to the relationship, keeping someone there. Because keep in mind, not everyone is bad all the time, right? If that was the case, if someone was a monster all the time or mean all the time, then it would be easier to leave. It would play out differently. And that becomes a stage of hope. The honeymoon stage. This is a glimpse of who I fell in love with. This is the person that, I'm getting a glimmer of that good father. I'm getting that glimmer of the person I first fell in love with, right? And I want you back. Like, I don't like all this other stuff, but I see a glimmer of you, and that's who I want. Like, that's what I want, you back. And I'm hoping that I can get you back. And now you're crying in front of me and you're upset, and I have a good heart. And it's like, and I'm hoping that you'll change, right? And so that becomes a stage of hope, and it becomes an anchor in that relationship, because then what happens is you go back to tension building, and then explosion, and then honeymoon. Boom, 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 boom. Going faster and faster and becoming more violent. Eventually, as the relationship increases in length, the honeymoon gets completely annihilated. Think about, why would the honeymoon stage get annihilated? Like, that was an anchor, right? Don't you still need the anchor? Like, why would that vanish? Well, eventually a person is controlled in all the various ways. Controlled financially, controlled mentally, controlled physically, controlled sexually, right? All the different ways that one's controlled. That the honeymoon is no longer needed. The shoulda, woulda, couldas, the tears, the gifts, no longer is needed. Because if I'm an abuser and my partner is controlled in all those ways, I don't need to waste my time. I don't need to sell you anything, right? Because I have you controlled, right? And so that's the same thing, right, in domestic violence relationships. And so then it just goes back to tension building explosion, boom, 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 back and forth. Really, survivors living in a state of anxiety, and really kind of like a World War III in their own home, if you will. And so that's the cycle of violence. I'm hoping that makes sense to you. So this is what takes place in a domestic violence home. The next slide you're going to see is the effects of adult victims. So we're going to move into the effects of adult victims and also move into the effects of the children. So the effects on adult victims, some of it, when you look at that slide, it makes sense, right? So you're going to have low self-esteem, but also keep in mind that people in domestic violence relationships don't always start off with low self-esteem. There's an assumption that, it's implied, like, oh, well, that person has so low self-esteem. Not necessarily so, because that could be symptomatic, right? That one can be in a relationship and because they're slowly being emotionally battered, have a high self-esteem, and then eventually ends up having a very low self-esteem. There's also feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. The average person is not trained in domestic violence, right? So friends and family while their intent might be good, right? But they're saying all the wrong things. And they're saying all these victim blaming things that make you feel worse. and really kind of maybe in some ways pushing you closer to your abuser. Um, that includes service providers. The average service provider is not trained in domestic violence. I'm hoping that it's a little better now, but when I was in the field, when I first began to enter, when I entered the field in 2001, and I realized the degree of how many people are not trained, how teachers are not trained, how social workers weren't trained, how, just some counselors weren't trained. And so what that translates to is survivors not being understood. And so really feeling helpless and hopeless, kind of like the Tupac, like me against the world, right? And really feeling alone. And already the perpetrator blames them, they blame themselves, and then family blames them, and then social service providers blame them. And it's like they can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. They feel hopeless and helpless. A lack of self-compassion is very common. So really survivors will have a tremendous heart for other people and really feel someone's pain and be empathetic, but oftentimes minimize their own pain, right? So lacking that self-compassion. We return, if you look at that closely on the slide, do you see it? Minimizing, denying, and blaming. Yes. So sound familiar, right? So when we went to the slide, we go back to the slide of red flags or perpetrators, right? Minimizing, denying, and blaming. So what they're saying in terms of blaming the victim, blaming drugs and alcohol, minimizing the abuse, denying it happened. Now the survivor of abuse is doing that. So the external messages of what they heard and hear are now, the seeds are planted, they're blooming, and now I'm saying it as a victim of abuse, right? So now I'm saying it really wasn't that big of a deal. Like, he slapped me, but he didn't punch me. Like, he could have punched me, right? Like, it's not that big of a deal. Or he just slightly pushed me. It might sound like denying. I don't know what you're talking about. You keep saying that happened, on Christmas, but I don't remember that. Maybe you dreamt it. It wasn't me. And your friend's like, no, it was you. And you're like, I don't remember that. Nope. I don't know what you're talking about. Blaming, where you might be talking with a friend or a family member or a social service provider, and you're saying the exact same things that were said to you. Well, it's kind of my fault, that he shoved me in a wall because I did speak up. I did yell. And so again, taking on that blame. What's very interesting with survivors is survivors of abuse blame themselves for everything. Like, they take on all the responsibility. And what's very key with abusers, they take none. And so it's interesting dynamic. You'll see there in green horizontal hostility. And this is really interesting. And I see it play out very often. And so in domestic violence relationships, you have the imbalance of power and control. And this person here that lacks power and control and decision making feels all of those natural feelings, right? So they might be hostile, they might be angry, but it's not safe to act out that hostility and anger to the perpetrator. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, that's not safe. So that hostility goes horizontally to friends, family members, strangers, maybe even service providers. And it's really kind of like jabbing them so that you feel, knocking their successes, knocking what they have to say, doing some type of disrespect mentally or verbally against someone that they feel that's on their level to feel better about themselves, right? And so the hostility goes sideways. So hopefully that makes sense. There's more to it, but I'm going to leave it there for now. So it comes out with friends and family. Let's say there's a group of friends and someone gets on the dean's list. And they're like, oh my God, did you hear how Enrique got on the dean's list? How awesome. Oh, he's so amazing. And the person might be like, oh, well, yeah, I mean, He probably cheated his way. I mean, yeah, he got the award, but I mean, he's not that smart. He probably cheated. It would sound something like that. So knocking them, so you feel a little bit better about yourself, right? There's also physical ailments such as back pain, stomach aches, and headaches are an example, right? So that our stress physically manifests, right, into back pains, headaches, and all of that. And then substance abuse. So many folks that are in pain, including domestic violence, will numb, right? And we all probably know numbing, right? Some people shop, some people drink, some people do drugs, some people go on social media, some people cut. It's kind of a whole range of different things on how people address their pain. Substance abuse is one of them. And so what's tricky about that is that what a person might start drinking or start doing drugs to put the volume down on the pain. But what happens is initially they're in control, yes? Yes. But the way that addiction works is on one moment you're in control and you do it enough that now the substance is in control. And so that's what takes place. And if someone now has substance abuse and is addicted, and they also are trying to flee their domestic violence relationship, it becomes that much more problematic because now they're facing one, trauma, number two is homelessness because they're trying to flee, and now substance abuse. So that it becomes even more complicated and harder to serve, unfortunately, the way that our institutions are set up. And I would go, if I was there in person, I'd go into it a little bit more, but that's what I'm going to give you. Let's see. So the effects on children, right? So we talked about the effects on adults, and now really the effects on children. The effects on children, you'll see the list, right? Shame, guilt, self-blame, conflicting feelings, depression, anger, acting out or withdrawing, bullying, aggression or passivity, caretaking behavior, lying, manipulation, anxiety, and then physical effects on the brain development. So I'm not going to go over all of them. Some of them are self-explanatory, right? So it's understandable why folks would feel shame. It's not their fault. It's not the survivor's fault or the children's fault, but that still doesn't mean that they don't feel shame about it or feel guilty. Children will oftentimes feel guilty because it's like, I love both parents, but one parent's harming another parent, and I love them, but I'm angry at one, and I'm frustrated at another, but I love them, and I'm confused. They say they love each other, and they have this cycle of violence of like, they're angry, and then one hurts another one, and then they're forgiven, and then we're anxious, and then there's abuse, and then they're sorry again, and it's just all over the place, right? So with that comes tons of other emotions and conflicting emotions. Self-blame, because many times the children, in particular the eldest children or the eldest child, wants to stop or fix the abuse that's happening at home, and they can't. Like, the only person that can stop it is the one causing it, right? But children don't understand that often. And so it becomes problematic, right? And children will take on that self-blame, and it's not their fault, right? It's not their fault. And depression, right? That's understandable. Anger, that's, yes. Acting out or withdrawing, so the two extremes, right? Withdrawing or full on kind of in your face. We see the linkage between domestic violence and bullying behavior. And so I always find it interesting, like in schools, like you're in a school, right? So schools, we'll talk about anti-bullying all day, and that's socially acceptable, but bullying is also connected to domestic violence. Like, where's the violence learned? And overwhelmingly is learned in the home, right? And so we see children in domestic violence households, and how many of them oftentimes learn that violence solves things, And so, especially if you're bigger or smarter or whatever, right? And so they carry that on in school, and they start the um, really that pattern, or they continue that pattern at school, and then eventually in their own relationships. Not always, 86% of abusers grew up in violent homes, and so that violence is learned, and the importance thing about that is that it can be unlearned, right? Like that's the hopeful piece to it, is that it can be unlearned. Um, let's see, bullying, aggression, or passivity. Again, the extremes. Caretaking behavior. Usually the eldest child will try really will become like the surrogate parent. They'll become like little mom, little dad. And they will take care of the adult victim. They will try to intervene when there's violence. They will try to take care of the siblings that are younger. They might cook, they might clean. They have to grow up so much quicker out of survival. And with growing up quicker comes a lot of those emotions of, well, I wish I could play. I wish I could hang out with my friends. I wish I could go to prom, but I have to come home and I have to make sure my dad doesn't kill my mom, right? And so it can include a lot of different emotions, and there's a lot of experiences with that. So let's see, caretaking behavior. Lying and manipulation is another one, and I want to say that very carefully. Like, these are not children that are, bad kids, right? This is survival, so that they've learned to lie and manipulate to get their needs met, right? They've lied or manipulated to get their needs met. So it's not as if they're like signing up to lie and manipulate. It's just like, they oftentimes live in a household where it's not safe to say, Mom and Dad, I need a new backpack, or can you give me money for lunch money? So they have to think of creative ways that oftentimes including lying and manipulation to get those needs met, to feed their bellies maybe, to get those new shoes that don't have holes in them, to get a backpack that's not falling apart. And the difficulty of that is that while it's a survival skill and they learn it to survive, that when they're out of the violent household and maybe they've grown, they're older, that many times they still utilize those same methods to get their needs met. I've had to have conversations with adults, like friends of mine, and just been like, I appreciate your struggle when you were young of what you had to do to survive, but you're safe now. You're safe now. And since you're safe, you don't have to lie or manipulate, right? So you have to unlearn ways, or what we say in sociology, learn to have a re-socialization, learn new ways of being, and realize I can say thank you and goodbye to those old ways that helped keep me alive. And I have to learn new ways and replace them, right, with those new ways. Anxiety, that makes sense, right? So if you're living in constant anxiety, and it's kind of all over the place, that's going to impact your mental health. We disconnect from our past. We really think like, okay, well, I have high anxiety today as an adult or as a teen, and we don't connect it to our childhood. And many times there's a direct link. If you ask yourself, when are my earliest memories that I can think of when I became anxious, right? Or what are the first memories that I can think of exhibiting depression? Oftentimes they're trauma produced, but we forget about that because that happened a long time ago, and that was when I was a kid, and I'm grown now, or I'm a teenager now, right? Holy shit. Sorry, I lost you. The video just disappeared completely. I don't know what happened. So I apologize for that. So again, we don't link our past with our present, and it's highly linked together. And then you'll see the last one, it says physical effects on brain development. And so really kind of thinking about Dr. Bruce Perry's work. Very fascinating doctor and educator. He came to our area. He came to Modesto several times at the Domestic Violence National conference. And his work surrounds trauma in the brain and the brain development. And he has shown, with his research, he has shown like images of a child that was exposed to extreme domestic violence and a child that was not, and looked at their brain. And the one that was exposed to extreme domestic violence between the ages of 0 and 5 had smaller brains. They were darker in color. There was less connections. And what that translated to was that the children that were exposed to extreme domestic violence, womb to 5 years old, that it was connected to, it translated to short memory loss, right? Memory loss of like only of short-term memory. They would have a difficult time doing any type of abstract thinking, like such as math and problem solving, because the way that the brain is developed, it develops the brainstem first, and the last part to be developed is the front part of the brain, which is really abstract thinking. And so the brain can kind of slow down or be fixated in certain areas, and oftentimes the fight or flight area of your brain. The important thing to know is that your brain doesn't really, really fully stop developing until the age of 25. But that extreme domestic violence can have a real impact on brain development and translates to some of us have to study twice as hard or 3 times as longer than maybe friends. Some folks struggle with any type of abstract thinking, such as math, right? Some folks will just have to admit, like, I need tutoring, right? That doesn't make me dumb. That doesn't make me stupid. It just makes me that my brain is developed a little differently. And it might be trauma-induced, right? It doesn't mean that it's a lost cause. It just means that your brain learns differently and that you might need to have different measures to help you with your learning, right? So those are the effects. And I'll do one more slide, and then I'm going to leave you because that equals probably about an hour and a half or an hour and I don't know. I think those 2 videos, part 1 and part 2, are pretty good to be able to have class with that time, and then I can come swoop on in on Friday and I could finish the lecture, right? And when I come in on Friday, I'll talk about leaving abusive relationships, right? And the process of leaving and what that looks like. So to end the segment, I just want to say that, there we go. We do see gender variables as it relates to the effects on children. And gender is very different than sex, right? So gender is really the social cultural characteristics associated with being a man or a girl, a man or a boy, girl, a woman. And when we incorporate that gender variable, we really see that boys oftentimes will develop anger issues, fighting, breaking things, bullying behavior, and will oftentimes have homicidal thoughts, right? Like thoughts of harming someone else, even to the point of thoughts of like killing someone. What we see with girls is we see that girls have eating disorders, sleeping disorders, self-mutilation, or also known as cutting, and they oftentimes learn to accept and expect abuse. And while boys have homicidal thoughts of harming the other, girls have suicidal thoughts of harming oneself. So it's very interesting on how that plays out and what that might translate in a school setting, right? The person that is, the children that are affected is not always the one that has become the bully. It's not always the one that is aggressive, but it can also be the person that is flying under the radar, right? That is getting all A's because school is their haven, right? School in many ways might be rescuing them. And it might be a little more challenging to identify girls in particular that are survivors of abuse because they're self-inflicted abuse, right? The effects oftentimes harm oneself. So you might not know that they have an eating disorder because you're not, I don't know, like you're not necessarily seeing them eat, or you're not at home where they're sleeping all day or not sleeping at all. Oftentimes when people cut or do self-mutilation, the cutting is happening in areas that are not obvious. Usually, like it is in areas that you don't see, and then it might progress where now it's in areas that the public can see, right? So that's a progression that may take place. And really the learning of accepting and expecting abuse. So this is what I see. This is the norm in my family, and I don't know of another way, right? So the expectation of this is what happens in relationships, when in fact, no, this is not how it happens with all relationships. That there are relationships that are happy and they're safe. And again, girls will have the suicidal thoughts rather than the homicidal thoughts. And we do see the variations, right? So we do see the exceptions to the rule. But typically when we look at gender, the patterns of behavior is that how boys are affected and how girls are affected. But we do have those exceptions where girls are acting out physically, they're acting out externally, and boys and even young men are harming themselves and having suicidal thoughts, and also in the last recent years are also taking part in self-mutilation or cutting behavior, right? So that's important to be able to acknowledge. Like I mentioned, I'm going to end on that note, and I will continue this lecture, and we'll finally end it on Friday when I talk about leaving, and what else I want to be talking about. I'm talking about leaving. I'm going to talk about the process of leaving, the barriers to leaving, some important considerations, and then what can you do if that you're moved by this information, right? And I'm hoping that you are moved by it. And that I will go over, let's see, keep in mind that the last numbers or the last slide on the PDF, it reminds you that you're not alone. It reminds you, if we look at those numbers of how many people have been impacted directly or indirectly, that you are not alone. And there's 2 phone numbers that are really important right underneath that saying. One is the local domestic violence hotline number or agency number. That is a business phone number. So between Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, it is a business line where there's supportive services, there's counseling, there's case management, there's support groups. There's just these range of services that you can utilize. It's a nonprofit, so most of the services are free to a sliding scale. But it is my understanding that they won't turn anyone away because of an economic need. That is also the phone number that you're going to need to memorize, because you'll never know when you'll need it. You'll never know when a family member will need it, or a friend or a stranger. So I'm requiring you to memorize that number. Also, after 5 o'clock, it becomes a crisis line number. So if this lecture triggers you, that you can call that number at any time, after 5, before 5, on the weekend, and someone's going to pick up that phone. And if you're in crisis, you need to let them know, I'm not doing well and I need to talk to someone about this, right? That's what this number's for, right? Or if you're curious to know what services are there, maybe you want to start your road of healing. Maybe you want to continue your road of healing, right? And then the number underneath it is the National Domestic Violence Hotline number. So that's the national number. You're not going to be tested on it, but it's important to have. You never know when someone will need it. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to say thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully it wasn't too painful. I'm probably not going to watch it. So I'm going to assume first take, and that's what you're getting, right? So because of our schedules not matching up, and that I can't come in on a Wednesday because my day with you is Tuesdays and Fridays, and Wednesday I have another class that I teach exactly at the same time on the MJC campus. So I can't be at multiple places at once. I wish I could. I heard that the last class that I missed because of my training that was fantastic. I saw the selfie, which I missed you all even more. So please take notes on this video, and I will see you all on Friday. I miss you all. Bye.